One of the best techniques that I think flies under the radar for a lot of UX designers is object-oriented UX design. Now, object-oriented UX design is derived from something called object-oriented programming. And this is a technique that's been used in software engineering and data modeling for years. Really, what this focuses on is the objects and things a user interacts with and the actions that they perform based on those things, rather than the linear or steps or flow that a user is going to complete. What I want to talk about today is how a programming technique can actually make you a better designer. Most UX designers spend their time thinking about user flows and journey maps. And these are really great tools to get a sense of the tasks and the requirements that a system needs to be able to perform. It helps us understand the requirements on the user. It helps us kind of get an understanding and alignment around what the things that a user is going to need to do. But the flows and journeys can be actually quite misleading to the actual requirements of a product, and it could be limiting in how you explore what a product or feature should do. The primary problem with flows and journeys is that they are pretty linear. But what happens when we get something more complex, where the flow or the linear nature of a product is not quite as obvious? In healthcare, a lot of the products and kind of requirements that products fill for users is not linear at all. In fact, there is a lot of almost cyclical in nature work. In fact, when I have spent my time interviewing physicians or clinicians in healthcare, focusing on a flow is actually pretty limiting and assuming tasks that either are outdated, irrelevant, or unnecessary. Object-oriented UX provides an opportunity for us to understand the complete nature of the requirements of a feature and helps us and gives us a foundation to further build on in order to create something that is truly solving the problem at hand. So let's take a look at a particular problem in healthcare that I think object-oriented UX can help us solve. I want to talk a little bit about charting. In healthcare, there is something called a chart, and specifically in electronic health records, charts are things that a physician needs to complete in order to essentially document their interaction with a patient. Now, the documentation is an important part of a chart, but there's another important part of that chart that is quite often overlooked, and that is the billing aspect. For all intents and purposes today, I'm not going to really touch on the billing aspect too much, but that object-oriented UX can help us solve that as well. But what I want to talk about is the actual act of creating a chart. Because if we were to create a linear flow that demonstrates how a physician charts, we'd actually be looking at something that makes a lot of assumptions about how that action happens. So if we were to do this, and so let's go ahead and create an estimate for what we might look at when we look at a linear charting flow. So let's go ahead and make a linear user flow diagram for charting. We might have a clinician kind of, opens the chart. They might say, I'm going to, read details about the patient. They may interview the patient and perform an exam. And then they might say, I'm going to start writing the chart. Now, now we're making a pretty high level diagram here. This is really just very high level to kind of get an idea of the user journey. We're not really talking about a user flow so much. But let's talk about the actual process of writing the chart. So I'm going to make a new diagram down here, and I'm going to say, okay, so we're going to write the chart. Now, we know charts and specifically notes are made up of several different sections. The subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. To create some efficiency, we want to standardize around how a user creates a section and edits that section. Add a section, and then they're going to edit the section. And within that editing experience, they can add things like I'm going to say we can add things like variables. Maybe we can add things like preset sentences. We can maybe even add things like rich content or media. So like we could say, hey, we're going to let you add like, an imaging scan or a chart that demonstrates, the history of blood pressure or something like that. Now, I have all these things, and then the next part of this is really, code the chart, which is essentially how a physician will say, this is what I think we can be billed for, and then sign. Now, the cool thing about this is I get an idea of here's kind of the high level things that someone needs to do. I know that they need to edit section, that there are going to be, different types of sections potentially, that there are going to be different types of variables, there's going to be rich content, there's this task around coding, but I haven't really dived into the details here. Now, we can actually create much more detailed flows in this as well, but one of the things that might be challenging here is once we do, we end up with potentially 5 or 6 different flows and really quite a mess of different, potential pathways that a clinician may need to actually flow through in order to complete this step. So where does object-oriented UX come into play here? So if we were going to take this and give an object-oriented perspective on this flow, I would actually start with this. So I would start with the note sections. So I'm going to create a new heading here, and I'm going to say just like note sections. So I can look at this and immediately start saying, okay, what are the things inside of a note section? Well, for one thing, we're going to have a type of section. So that's going to be, essentially the subjective, objective, assessment, or plan. This can also be the physical exam, the history, present illness, the review of systems, those types of things. The note sections are also going to have text that the user enters themselves. So I'm going to call this user entered text. And we want to give them the ability to add variables. And so I'm just going to call it variables. Now, already I can begin to think about how I can see the difference between text that a user is entering in terms of like how that's going to work and how someone might want to enter a variable. Whereas, we might need to think about a trigger key or something along those lines for a variable. Now, in addition to this, I'm going to be thinking about, I'm going to change the color here, but I'm going to think about what are the actions someone needs to perform on a section. Now, I'm not even talking about the text itself. I'm just talking about the section as a whole. So I need to be able to add it, of course, and remove. So I'll just add that all in one thing as kind of a grouping of actions. I might also want to be able to save as a template, right? So we might want to give them the ability to do that. And we probably need to be able to give them some kind of ability to move or to edit the type of section. So I'm going to say like editing and moving, I'll call it editing and management. And so already, not only have I created more granularity behind what this type of kind of feature needs to be, I've actually started thinking about not only the differences between the things that someone is going to be interacting with and the things they need to do to those things, the actions they need to take. And this is the key piece of object-oriented UX. Object-oriented UX is not just about what are the tasks in the flow, it's about what are the things and what are the actions on those things. Now, I've only done this one column, but I can make another column and call it type of section. So I could actually make this now like kind of like a subset of the types themselves, and I can call this section types. And then I could say like, we want our history of present illness, we want our, chief complaint, and I could go down the list that way as well. Now, what are the actions that I can perform there? Well, it could be renaming something, right? So like if, we could standardize in terms of our data model that we want a user to be able to rename subjective to history of present illness, or something along those lines. Or we could say we want them to, kind of be able to rename assessment to exam or something. So we could give that customizability to the user, but we wouldn't really get into that thought process with just the flow itself. We would in fact have to create an entirely different flow and almost scope out an entirely different feature set to even begin to think about that. And the other thing that I think object-oriented UX can really help us understand is we go beyond what users tell us they think they want, and we begin to understand what it is they're trying to do. What are the goals behind actually interacting with these things, rather than what are the tasks that they're already performing and that's what they think they want to do. I hope that makes sense. Now, I hope this helps. I'm going to link some articles and things about object-oriented UX down below. But I hope you can get an idea of how object-oriented UX can give you a really great overview and kind of help you understand the scope of a product much faster than creating just linear flows can. But on the same hand, there's still this need for us to understand how someone is going to interact with these things. Where do we begin to get into the actual flow of information and the interaction patterns that dictate that information? Well, if you want to learn about that, you're going to have to wait for the next video, and I hope you'll subscribe and leave a comment if this was really interesting to you. But I really appreciate you watching, and I will see you real soon.